Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Encounter in Pisgah, submitted by The Wandering Wizard. I was 24 years old in the summer of 2019 when I decided to spend 4 nights alone in Pisgah National Forest. At the time, I considered myself a practical person. I loved hiking, camping, and being outdoors, but I didn't believe in monsters, ghosts, or anything paranormal. If someone told me they saw some creature in the woods, I would have assumed they misidentified a bear, a coyote, or simply let their imagination run wild. After what happened on this trip, I'm not so sure anymore. I'd chosen a remote spot several miles from the nearest trailhead, and getting there required crossing a creek, climbing a steep ridge, and following a faint game trail that eventually disappeared into thick forest. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. No other campers, no campgrounds, no people at all. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent beside a small clearing surrounded by enormous trees, and a narrow stream ran by. The sounds of rushing water filled the forest, and I spent the afternoon exploring and then returned back to camp before dark. That first night, I sat beside my fire watching sparks just drift off into the dark night overhead, and the forest felt peaceful. The only sounds were insects and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, I heard something moving beyond the edge of the firelight. At first, I assumed it was a deer. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, and I grabbed my flashlight and swept it through the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped immediately. So I listened for several minutes before eventually convincing myself it had just been an animal passing through. I went to sleep and didn't think much more about it. The next morning, I found tracks in the damp soil near my camp, and what struck me wasn't their size, but their shape. They looked vaguely human. I knew enough about tracking to recognize bear prints, and these were not bear tracks. They weren't deer either. They resembled human footprints, except they were much longer and wider than any person's foot should have been. I shrugged it off and just continued my trip. That evening, however, the feeling of being watched started creeping in. Several times while gathering firewood, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. The sensation was impossible to explain. It felt like somebody was standing behind a tree just out of sight, observing me. Every time I looked, there was nothing there. But as darkness settled over the forest, the feeling intensified. I sat by the fire for hours because I suddenly had no desire to crawl into my tent. The woods beyond the firelight seemed different somehow, and the darkness looked thicker somehow. Around 1 a.m, I heard a strange sound from the ridge overlooking the camp. It wasn't a howl or a scream. It sounded like a person trying to imitate both at the same time. The noise rose and fell through the trees before fading away, and every hair on my body stood up. I just sat there with my flashlight in my hand, and the sound came again about 20 minutes later. And this time, it was closer. I didn't sleep much that night. The third day was when things became genuinely frightening. I left my camp to hike along the stream and explore a section of forest farther downhill. And about an hour later, I realized I was not alone. Something was paralleling me through the woods. Whenever I stopped walking, it stopped. And whenever I moved, it moved. I could hear branches snapping occasionally and leaves rustling, and once I caught a glimpse of something gray moving and slipping behind a cluster of trees. I shouted out a greeting, and no response came, but everything in the forest became silent. I hurried back to my camp, and that evening I seriously considered just packing up and getting out of there. The only reason I stayed was dumb pride. I didn't want to admit that some unidentified animal had scared me out of the woods. As darkness arrived, I built the largest fire I could manage, and for several hours, nothing happened. And then, shortly after midnight, I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the firelight from the tree line. They were much higher off the ground than a deer's eyes could have been, and the figure remained completely still. So I shined my flashlight toward it, and for the briefest moment, I saw a tall gray shape standing between the trees. And then it was gone. I didn't hear it run or walk away. It just kind of vanished. 1 minute my beam was looking at this thing, and the next it was just on empty forest. I spent the rest of the night awake, just staring into the darkness, and the following day I decided I would leave in the morning. It was just one last night. That was it. I gathered some extra firewood quickly and kept the fire burning well after midnight, but eventually exhaustion won. I climbed into my tent and fell asleep, but not long later something hit the side of my tent, and the impact jolted me awake. For a moment I thought a bear had stumbled into camp, and then another blow slammed against the fabric. My heart nearly stopped. I quickly grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, and a massive shape moved outside. The silhouette circled the tent, and I could hear heavy breathing. Not animal breathing. It sounded disturbingly human. This creature, whatever it was, dragged something across the side of the tent, and immediately I thought claws. At least that's what they sounded like. The fabric stretched inward a little bit, and then came a deep growl unlike anything I'd heard ever before. The sound vibrated through my chest, and another impact hit the tent. A pole snapped, and the structure partially collapsed around me. The panic seemed to explode through my body, and I knew staying inside meant getting trapped. So without thinking, I unzipped the tent and just burst outside. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, but standing near the edge of the camp was the thing that had been stalking me. And even now, I struggle to describe it. It was tall and covered in gray hair, but not thick fur like a bear. Its limbs looked long and thin, and its shoulders were hunched. The face appeared almost human, yet horribly distorted, and most terrifying of all were its eyes. They reflected red from the dying fire. We stood there, this thing and I, just looking at each other, and then it lunged forward, and I stumbled backwards toward my fire pit. My hand landed on a thick piece of wood that was still glowing with red-hot embers, and acting purely on instinct, I grabbed it. The heat burned my palm, and the creature came at me again, and I swung with everything I had. The ember-covered log connected with the side of this thing's face as it leaned over me, and I felt it strike something soft. This thing unleashed a scream so horrifying that I still hear it in my nightmares, and it seemed to just echo across the mountains. The burning end of the log had struck its eye, and the thing reeled backward, clutching its face, and then it turned and fled into the darkness. Branches snapped violently as it crashed through the forest, and within seconds, it was once again gone. I stood there shaking uncontrollably and dropped the piece of wood I had onto the ground. I was waiting for it to return at any moment, but instead the forest became silent. I didn't dare leave the side of the fire. I threw more wood into the flames until dawn arrived. Every shadow that night seemed threatening. Every sound made my pulse spike. When the first sunlight finally filtered through the trees, I broke camp in record time. I stuffed everything into my backpack, abandoned several pieces of damaged gear, and practically ran back to my truck. I never once looked back. When I reached civilization, I stopped to get something to eat. Still scared, still shaking. I told a few of the locals what had happened to me, and most laughed, but one older guy at the counter I was sitting at didn't. He listened to me carefully and then asked where I'd been camping. After I told him, he nodded slowly at me, and then he asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Did it have gray hair and human eyes, son?" I stared at him, and he simply said, "Sounds like a grayback." Then he went on to explain what he meant. And according to him, stories about the grayback had circulated through parts of the mountains for generations. Some described it as a spirit, and others believed it was an undiscovered creature, but most people just blew it off as folklore. And maybe they're right. Maybe I did encounter an injured bear under unusual lighting conditions, and maybe my exhausted mind exaggerated what I saw. That's the explanation I try convincing myself, and have been convincing myself of for years. The problem is that bears don't leave footprints shaped like human feet. They don't stalk people for 4 straight days. and they certainly don't stand upright outside a tent breathing like a man. I went into Pisgah National Forest as a skeptic who laughed at stories about monsters, but I came out with scars on my hand from that burning log and a memory that still wakes me up in the middle of the night. What Can We Do? Submitted by Dave. I'm Dave, and if anyone has dealt with something similar, I need advice because my family is running out of ideas. In the spring of 2019, my grandmother passed away at the age of 91. My grandfather had died years earlier, and because my mother was an only child and already had her own home, ownership of the house eventually passed to me. My wife Cheryl and I had been living in a 3-bedroom home with our kids, and it wasn't the biggest of places. It was getting a little cramped for both my wife and I, and my son Ben, who was 14, and Candace, we call her Candy, who was 16. Grieving my grandmother's passing was not easy, but over time, inheriting the house felt like her last blessing for us, and we are eternally grateful, despite the problems we're having right now. The house sits in a quiet suburb outside Atlanta. It was built in 1965 and was unlike anything we could ever have afforded on our own. It was over 3,500 square feet with a finished basement, a huge backyard, and an in-ground pool. There were tons of old oak trees, and the entire thing sat on nearly an acre of land. Mind you, most of the neighboring homes sat on tiny lots, but our property felt almost secluded, despite being in the suburbs. I grew up visiting that house every weekend. Even as a kid, I remembered strange things happening there, though. I remembered hearing footsteps in empty rooms and seeing shadows pass through doorways. And I remembered my cousins refusing to sleep in the basement during family gatherings. One Thanksgiving when I was 10, every child in the house swore they had heard someone crying downstairs after midnight. The adults always laughed it off, and over time I convinced myself that we had been feeding off one another's imaginations. By the time my family moved in, I honestly believed that that was all it had been, imagination. Our first month there was perfect. We painted the walls, replaced old carpeting, and spent weekends cleaning decades of accumulated belongings from closets and storage rooms. The kids loved having so much space, and Cheryl adored the kitchen. Every evening felt like we were living in a dream house. And then little things started happening. The basement lights would switch on by themselves. At first I blamed old wiring. The house was over 50 years old. But then doors started opening. Not swinging open dramatically, but quietly. You would close a door, leave a room, and then come back to find it standing open several inches. And no, there was nothing wrong with the hinges, and yes, the doors were always fully closed. We tested them a number of times. The first person who became genuinely disturbed was Candy. One afternoon she came downstairs looking pale, and she had asked if Mom had been in her room. Cheryl hadn't. Candy said she'd been doing homework with headphones on when she noticed someone standing in her doorway. Just assuming it was her mom, she kept working. Several minutes later, she looked up and realized no one was there. But she insisted she had clearly seen a person. I told her it was probably just a reflection or a trick of the light. And looking back, I wished that had been all it was. A few weeks after that, Ben came running upstairs from the basement. He was shaking. He told us he heard someone whispering his name. And he'd just been playing video games alone when he heard a woman's voice directly behind him say, "Ben." He said it wasn't a distant sound, and it wasn't anything from the television. It was right behind him. And when he turned around, no one was there. Cheryl and I looked at each other. 2 different stories, but they were both creepy. And we wanted to make sure we were rationalizing everything. Kids imagine things, and old houses make noises. We were convinced there had to be an explanation. And then, my wife Cheryl experienced something herself. She was folding laundry in our bedroom one afternoon when she heard movement in the hallway. Thinking one of the kids needed something, she stepped out, but no one was there. As she turned back toward the bedroom, she saw a woman standing beside our bed. and the figure appeared only for a second before disappearing. Cheryl told me that she looked pale and was slightly transparent, with dark hair hanging around her face. It bothered Cheryl so much that as she was telling me all of this, she started crying. I'd never seen my wife so frightened like that, and for the first time I began wondering whether my childhood memories were really imagination or if they had been real. The activity intensified throughout that summer. Footsteps now became common to hear. Doors slamming was another common sound. Cabinets would open by themselves, and several times we woke up to find kitchen drawers pulled completely out. One morning, every dining room chair had been turned toward the hallway leading to the basement door, and no one admitted doing it. I certainly know it wasn't me. And the atmosphere in the house just felt off. Visitors commented on it without even prompting them. My brother stopped by one afternoon and asked why the basement made him feel sick, and a friend helping me repair the pool equipment refused to go downstairs alone after hearing what he described as female laughter coming from the storage room when no one else was home. By October, sleep for everyone had become difficult. Most nights, someone in the family heard movement, walking and pacing, slow footsteps crossing rooms overhead. One night, I followed the sounds from room to room, and every time I reached the source, the footsteps seemed to continue somewhere else, like I was being led through the house even. One night, following the footsteps around the house, it was around 2 a.m. I ended up standing outside the basement door, and the sound stopped immediately. I remember staring at the darkness beyond the stairs and feeling a level of dread I couldn't adequately describe. I just locked the door and went back upstairs. The following week, one night, Candy screamed so loudly that all of us ran to her room. She was standing on her bed and crying, pointing towards her closet. She said that a woman had been standing inside it, and not hiding and not peeking out, but just standing completely still and staring directly at her. Candy described the same woman that Cheryl had mentioned to me before. The same pale face, blank expression, and the dark hair. At that point, I didn't know what else to do, so the next day I contacted our church. Our pastor, who was a great guy, came over one evening, and he listened patiently while we explained everything that had been happening. He didn't make fun of us, and he didn't say the famous thing you always see in the movies about, the church can't help you. He walked through every room praying with us, and he blessed the house. Then he prayed with our family in the living room for nearly an hour. The experience brought all of us some comfort, and for several days afterwards, things seemed quieter. But, like in all the other stories you've heard about these sorts of actions and paranormal activities, they returned, worse than before. The footsteps resumed, and objects started moving around the house on their own, and doors slammed with enough force it was shaking the walls. One night, a framed family photograph flew from a shelf and shattered against the floor while all 4 of us were watching television in the same room. We were all on the couch, nobody was near it. There was no wind, no breeze, no shaking of the house, no earthquakes, no nothing. It just flew off the shelf and shattered on the floor. The most frightening development began in the basement then. Ben saw the woman first. He was coming upstairs after retrieving one of his basketballs, and halfway up the staircase, he looked toward the finished recreation room. A woman was standing near the far wall. He said she wasn't moving, and that she wasn't transparent, and for a moment Ben thought an actual person that was not in our family had entered the house. And then he said she vanished. Weeks later, Cheryl saw the same figure, and then I saw her. The sight happened so quickly I nearly fell down the stairs. She stood near the old furnace room. At one point, the house was heated with oil, and the old oil tank and equipment was still in that room. No one had ever removed it. We never really went in there. But there she was, standing there in front of me. Dark hair, long dress, head tilted downward. The moment I focused on her, though, she disappeared. After that, and this is worse, another woman began appearing. Unlike the first, she had lighter hair and looked older. Not long after that, we started to see the two figures often together. They were always silent and always just staring, and they always disappeared after just a few seconds. Well, my family stopped using the basement entirely after a little bit. No one wanted to encounter either one of those women. But the problem didn't stay down there. Soon the women began appearing elsewhere, in our hallways, standing in our doorways. Again, as I mentioned, one of them appeared in my daughter's closet. We'd see them at the top of the staircase, and one afternoon, Cheryl saw both figures standing outside beside the pool in broad daylight. Another time I looked through the kitchen window and saw one standing beneath one of our oak trees in the backyard, but when I rushed outside to investigate, there was no one there. The appearances became frequent enough that we started keeping written records, and within 3 months we documented over 40 separate sightings. We needed more help. Our pastor was great and continued to pray for us, and he actually urged us to find additional help as well. I did a little internet sleuthing and found a local ghost hunting group that didn't seem too crackpot. I expected them to dismiss us, as a matter of fact. They said that they had a very skeptical approach, and that's exactly what I needed. But the afternoon of their first visit, several members of their team, there were 5 in total, became visibly uncomfortable during this walkthrough. They had brought cameras and audio equipment and motion sensors, thermal devices, all kinds of equipment, and some stuff I have no idea whether it was legitimate or bunk. They came back the next night, a Friday night, and were going to have a full-night investigation. They didn't capture any video evidence of the women. Every camera either malfunctioned or recorded empty rooms whenever sightings were reported elsewhere. However, they did collect audio recordings. They played them back, and I heard them for myself. Several of them contained voices that weren't us. My family wasn't even home at the time. There were whispers, and a woman on one track quietly saying phrases that neither I or the investigators could fully understand. One recording captured what sounded like 2 female voices speaking simultaneously, and the last one contained a chilling statement that we could all hear clear as day. The words we heard were, "We stayed." The investigators spent weeks researching our property's history, and eventually they uncovered information that none of us had ever heard, at leastwise nobody in my family. Long before this subdivision existed, the land had been part of a farm dating back to the 19th century, and according to old newspaper archives, 2 sisters had lived on the property with their family during the late 1800s. Both of them had died under mysterious circumstances within a year of one another. One of them apparently vanished and was later discovered near a creek that borders the original farm, and the second died after suffering what the newspapers described as a severe mental decline after her older sister's death. Records suggested that both women had been buried in a small family cemetery that no longer existed. When developers built the subdivision during the 1960s, much of the land had been excavated and regraded. There was no formal cemetery, there were no headstones, and certainly no bodies. This wasn't like the movie Poltergeist. But the investigators believed portions of that old burial site may have been disturbed unknowingly during that construction. Their thought was, just because they didn't dig anything up or find any clear markers, that doesn't mean nothing was out there. Whether that explanation is true, I have no idea. But what happened next is what finally convinced me something genuinely paranormal exists in this world. I woke up around 3 a.m. after hearing Cheryl crying, and she was sitting upright in bed staring towards our bedroom door. And I followed her gaze. Both women were standing there, not transparent, not shadowy. They were standing in the doorway as clearly as living people. The dark-haired woman looked directly at us, and the older woman stared into the room from behind her. Neither of them moved, neither of them blinked, and this sighting lasted for almost half a minute before they faded away. It was by far the longest we'd ever seen them. I've never felt fear like that. I mean, it wasn't panic, it wasn't shock. It was a deep certainty that something impossible had entered our lives and our home. I cannot stress enough how much these were not just apparitions. These looked like 2 living beings. Our kids saw them repeatedly after this, sometimes together and sometimes separately. One appeared in the upstairs hallway when Ben was carrying laundry, and another stood beside Candy's bed one afternoon before vanishing. Again, each time they came running to us, telling us what they had seen, and that they didn't look like ghosts anymore, as Candy once said. They looked like people. The more that this got around in my family and my friend circle, a lot of them stopped visiting. Our kids became embarrassed and frightened and never invited their friends over anymore. And Cheryl started talking about moving. I couldn't blame her. The house that had once felt like a gift had become something none of us wanted to be inside of anymore. And as I write this, we're still here. The sightings continue. The voices continue. Every member of my family has witnessed the women multiple times, including my mother, who's still alive. We've prayed. We've sought help from our church. We've worked with investigators, and nothing has changed. If anyone has experienced persistent hauntings involving recurring apparitions like this, especially multiple figures appearing in daylight and being witnessed by several people at once, I genuinely appreciate guidance. My family is exhausted, we're frightened, and we're running out of options. I inherited what should have been my dream home, but instead it feels like we inherited something else that was already living here. I'm hoping that Uncle Josh's background in the paranormal radio show he used to have can help me out here. Maybe you can be that person. Thanks.
What Was It? Submitted by Eric J. I'm Eric, and this happened in the winter of 2006 when I was 17 years old. I've told this story only a handful of times because every time I do, I end up reliving it, and I don't really care to. People always want to know if I think it was a Wendigo what we saw. The truth is, I don't know what it was. I only know it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before or since, and whatever we encountered deep in Wabakimi Provincial Park nearly killed us. My uncles Jeff and Gord were experienced outdoorsmen. I'd grown up close with them. My dad died when I was 6 years old. They stuck around to take care of me. They had spent decades hunting, fishing, canoeing, and winter camping across northern Ontario. And they weren't the kind of men who scared easily. Gord was and is the toughest person I've ever known. He'd worked logging camps, survived a snowmobile accident that nearly took his leg off, and once spent an entire night stranded on a frozen lake after his machine broke down. He was a mean hockey player, and if something frightened Gord, it was worth paying attention to. The three of us had planned a 4-day snowshoe trip into a remote section of Wabakimi. This park is enormous if you've never been there, and in winter it becomes a frozen wilderness that could make you feel like you're the last people on Earth. We parked at a remote access point and headed into the backcountry under clear skies and temperatures below zero. The first day was perfect. The snow was deep but manageable, and the forest was silent except for the crunch of our snowshoes and the occasional groan of ice shifting somewhere beneath the lakes. By midday, we were several miles from the nearest road. It was Jeff who noticed the tracks first. He stopped suddenly and pointed toward a stand of black spruce and said, "What do you guys make of these?" At first, I assumed they belonged to a moose. And then I got closer. The prints were weird. They were spaced strangely, almost like something moving on two legs. Each impression was elongated and deep, as though whatever made them was unusually heavy. The tracks emerged from the trees and crossed our route, and then disappeared into another patch of forest. I said, "Is it a bear?" And Jeff said, "In January?" Gord knelt down beside one print for nearly a minute, and when he stood up, he didn't look convinced. He didn't share what he thought it was. All he said was, "I don't like it." That was it. And we continued on. Over the next several hours, we found the tracks repeatedly. Sometimes they crossed our path, and other times they were just alongside it, but from a distance. Once I looked through the trees and saw a line of fresh impressions matching our direction of travel, and it felt as though something was shadowing us. I tried convincing myself that there had to be a rational explanation. I mean, heck, maybe another hiker. Maybe somebody else just out exploring the area. But the farther we traveled, the less sense that made, and we hadn't seen another person all day. Near sunset, we reached a small clearing beside a frozen lake and established camp. We packed down the snow and pitched our winter tent and started preparing dinner. Darkness comes quickly in the winter, and much more so in the wilderness. I don't know why that is. It just is. It was right after we were eating that we heard the first sound. It was kind of a growl from a little far off. It was a long, wavering growl that echoed across the lake, and it rose and fell in pitch like an animal growling from a tremendous distance. The sound lasted nearly 15 seconds, and then everything went quiet. I looked at my uncles, and neither one of them said a word. Eventually, Jeff shrugged and said, probably a fox. We went to bed, but around midnight I woke up and needed to take a leak. The fire had burned down, and the moonlight was reflecting off the snow and illuminated the clearing with that eerie silver glow. I stepped outside the tent and immediately froze. There was something standing at the edge of the trees. At first I thought it was just a dead tree trunk, but then it moved. It seemed impossibly tall. It was thin and, I guess, angular. It stood partially hidden amongst the shadows and watching the campsite. My heart nearly stopped. I fell back into the tent and woke up both my uncles, and by the time we had emerged with flashlights, whatever I'd seen was gone. The snow beyond the camp revealed nothing except darkness and trees. But neither of my uncles made fun of me, and that alone terrified me. As much as they loved me, they picked on me mercilessly, but they didn't say a word that night. The next morning we discovered tracks circling our campsite. They were not there when we'd set up. They had appeared during the night, and the impressions formed a rough ring around our camp as though something had walked around us repeatedly. Some of them came within 10 meters of the tent. Jeff stared at them for a long time and then said, "We're leaving." It wasn't a discussion. We packed immediately. The return journey should have taken most of the day, and instead it became a nightmare. I had that feeling of being watched, and it seemed to get worse every kilometer we went. Several times we caught movement among the trees, a pale shape, a glimpse of something stepping behind a trunk. And once I turned quickly and saw what looked like a gaunt face peering from between two spruces. The skin appeared gray, and the eyes seemed enormous, and then it vanished. Once I turned quickly and saw what looked like a gaunt face peering from between two spruces, perhaps 50 meters away. The skin appeared gray. I could make out the eyes, and they seemed enormous, but then it disappeared. I told myself I must have imagined it. I really desperately wanted to believe I imagined it. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near a frozen creek. While eating, Gord suddenly stood up. His expression of relaxation had changed. Jeff asked him what was going on, but Gord didn't answer. He was just staring into the woods. So the two of us followed his gaze, and a figure stood amongst those trees, and this time there was no doubt something was there. It was incredibly thin, and it had really long limbs. This thing's head sat forward on its shoulders at this weird angle, and even from a distance I could tell it wasn't a bear or a moose or a wolf. The thing remained motionless for several seconds before slowly stepping behind a tree and then disappearing, and none of us spoke for over a minute. Then Gord said the words that still give me chills. "Don't run." We resumed moving, but not too fast. The creature continued following us, and sometimes we'd go an hour without seeing it. Then one of us would glance back and spot a shape moving between the trees. It was always there, watching and keeping pace. By late afternoon, the weather deteriorated, and clouds rolled in and snow began falling heavily. The forest became a maze of white, and under normal circumstances that would have been dangerous enough. But knowing something was tracking us made it much worse. As darkness approached, we realized we were not going to make it back to our vehicle, and we were going to have to make camp that night. The storm made further travel impossible, and none of us wanted to stop, but we really didn't have a choice. The second campsite felt different from the first. The woods seemed to be more on top of us there. The darkness beyond our lanterns and campfire just felt like it was alive. Dinner was quiet. Nobody was fooling around. Nobody was joking like the day before. None of us were relaxed. Then came the footsteps, crunching through the snow, slowly circling the camp once again. The sound was unmistakable. Something was definitely walking through the snow. But when we shined our flashlights into the darkness, we didn't see anything. But the footsteps would stop, and then a few minutes later they would resume, but from another direction. The circling continued for hours, and sometime after midnight, a horrifying scream erupted from the forest. The noise sounded close, much closer than the night before. I felt every hair on my body stand up, and the scream transitioned into something resembling laughter. And then it was dead silence. A short time later, we heard movement directly behind the tent, a heavy movement, and the sound of something breathing. It didn't sound like an animal breathing. It sounded like a human. It was slow and deliberate, and right outside the fabric of our tent. None of us moved. I remember taking my hunting knife out of its sheath and just sitting there clutching it. And that breathing continued for nearly a minute before it finally drifted away. At dawn, we emerged to find fresh tracks, less than a couple of meters from where we'd slept. The impressions led toward the forest, and Gord went off and followed them alone, despite Jeff's objections. He went into the trees, and 5 minutes passed, and then 10 minutes passed, and 15. No Gord. And then finally we heard him shouting. Not words, just shouting. So Jeff and I ran towards the noise, and we found Gord stumbling back through the snow. His face was white. I've never seen him look like that before. Jeff kept asking him, "What happened? What happened?" Gord didn't answer. Finally, Jeff said, "What did you see?" Gord said nothing. Not a single word. He just brushed past us and continued toward camp. We returned to civilization late that evening. The moment we reached the truck, Gord climbed inside and just sat there staring out the window. Over the next several days, Jeff repeatedly tried getting him to talk, but he refused to every time. And eventually, Gord said only one thing. "I got too close." That was it. That was all he said. Years later, after a few drinks, Jeff told me he'd privately asked Gord whether he'd seen a person, and Gord shook his head. Had it been a bear? Again, Gord shook his head, and then Jeff asked if he'd seen the thing's face. According to Jeff, Gord immediately ended the conversation and walked away. He never discussed the incident again. Gord passed away in 2018, and whatever happened out there died with him. But I still think about those tracks circling the tent. I think about the figure standing among the trees, and most of all, I think about the look on Gord's face after he vanished into the forest and encountered whatever had been following us. People can call it folklore. They can call it imagination. They can blame stress, isolation, or the wilderness playing tricks on us. Maybe they're right. But there are times I remember that breathing outside the tent wall and the feeling that something intelligent was standing really close to us, just a meter away, listening to us. And I remember the one man who feared absolutely nothing came back from the woods unable to speak about what he had seen. And that frightens me more than any monster ever could. Into the Barrens, submitted by Jenna E. Hey, Uncle Josh. I've been a long-time listener of your podcast, and I've got to say, it's still just as good as it was when you started. Maybe your voice is a little different, maybe you're a little bit more polished, but the stories are still terrific. It's taken me a long time to gather up the courage to write this down and share it with you, but I hope you like it. Having grown up in New Jersey, July is a heavy, living thing. But inside the Pine Barrens, it's a whole different kind of suffocating. Make all the jokes about New Jersey you want. I like it here. And back in July of 2015, I'd already been hiking and camping the backcountry for over a decade. I was completely comfortable with the kind of isolation that keeps casual hikers glued to the crowded beaches. I knew the rules of the pines like the back of my hand. Respect the ticks, carry twice the water you think you need, and never underestimate how easily those flat, endless pitch pines can swallow up your sense of direction. I consider myself an expert outdoorswoman, totally fine with pitching a tent alone or handling a midnight visit from a grumpy black bear. Despite all the movies and the creepy stories and legends, the Pine Barrens never scared me. They honestly felt like home. That afternoon, I picked out a secluded loop near Wharton State Forest for a quick 12-mile day hike. The sugar sand under my boots was bright white and blinding in the midday sun that was soaking up the heat and throwing it right back up through the soles of my shoes. By 4 in the afternoon, the whole atmosphere started to shift and dropped into that thick, heavy stillness that usually means a nasty summer thunderstorm is about to blow in. The cicadas, which had been absolutely screaming all morning, just stopped. A sudden silence like that always puts a hiker on alert, because it means a quick change in weather or that a major predator is nearby. I paused and wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand and listened. The silence was silent, except for the rhythmic, heavy crunch of my own footsteps when I started walking again. But a mile later, another rhythm started matching mine. It didn't sound like a deer crashing through the brush, and it didn't have the heavy, deliberate stomp of a bear. It was a light, rapid tapping, like bare feet or hard talons hitting the dry pine needles, perfectly timed with my pace. Every single time I paused to adjust my backpack, the sound behind me stopped a fraction of a second later, like whatever was walking with me was trying its best to mimic my exact footsteps. I remember whipping around, scanning the dense wall of oaks and pitch pine lining the narrow trail. I mean, look, the Pine Barrens are famous for folklore, as I mentioned, and while every local loves to whisper about the Jersey Devil, I'd always dismiss those stories as campfire nonsense meant to spook tourists, make movies about. At this point, I thought I was dealing with a feral dog, or maybe some creep who had no business being that deep in the woods. And I called out, "Hello?" my voice sounding incredibly flat and small against the air. "Whoever it is, I can hear you back there." Nobody answered, but the shadows between the trees seemed to get a whole lot deeper, my mind playing tricks on me. I decided right then to pick up the pace, wanting to hit the trailhead before the storm broke and before the daylight died completely. That was when the trailing turned into an outright chase. Whatever was behind me stopped trying to hide. The tapping sound sped up into a frantic, uneven gallop that seemed to bounce from the left side of the trail to the right and weave through the thickets with unbelievable speed. Suddenly, despite the humid July air, I got an unnatural chill, and whatever this was brought a smell with it that made my throat tighten up. This nasty, metallic stench of old copper and stagnant swamp water. I risked a quick look over my shoulder while pushing into a fast jog. And through the tangled branches of a pitch pine, I caught a glimpse of something that completely defied any understanding I had of local wildlife. It was tall and white, and it didn't run like an animal on fours, and it didn't walk upright like a human. Its limbs seemed to have these weird angles that looked skeletal, but it moved in this ovid, fluid lurch, using its arms to pull itself forward above the ground and the trunks of the trees. Adrenaline ran through me. I did my best to sharpen my focus as survival instincts took control of my body. I forced myself to not panic. Panicking in the woods is exactly how you get your ass dead. But I knew I was in immediate danger, so I broke into a full sprint, my boots thudding against the packed dirt of the trail as the first giant drops of a summer rain started punching through the trees. Behind me, this creature responded by letting out a sound that I can only describe as a wet rattle, like stones shaking around inside a pill bottle. And that was followed by this low, vibrating hum that I seemed to be able to feel through the soles of my boots. The thing was gaining ground fast on me, and every time I looked back, it was closer. this weird, pulpy, pale body standing out against the dark bark of the pines. It didn't have any recognizable face. It was just this smooth, featureless wedge of skin. And it felt like it was sniffing me or something, or following me by body heat rather than by sight. This crazy thing smashed through the thick blueberry bushes and scrub oaks without a worry in the world, and it snapped branches that would have tripped or tangled up any human runner. The trail started twisting through a low-lying cedar swamp where the path turned into a northern wooden boardwalk, and in the pouring summer rain, those cedar planks become slick as ice. I forced myself to keep my speed up and balanced carefully as the water below me churned from the downpour. The creature hit the boardwalk just a few seconds after I did, and the sound of the chase changed to a wet slapping noise against the wood. I was feeling like I was going crazy. This couldn't possibly be happening to me. It felt like maybe I was dreaming, but I wasn't. This thing was terrifyingly fast, and its movements oily and completely unaffected by the slippery surface of the boardwalk. And at this point, I could hear it breathing, this creepy, raspy wheeze. The metallic stench got so overpowering at that point that my eyes were watering and blurring my vision, but I sprinted toward the end of the boardwalk where the trail rose back into the sandy pine flats. I knew the parking lot was less than a mile away. My lungs were on fire, and the weight of my pack was dragging down on my shoulders. And I did something I've never done before. I unbuckled the chest strap and just threw the whole backpack off into the brush. I didn't give a shit about my gear at this point. I just wanted to get out of there alive. The sudden move of the pack, though, seemed to distract the thing for a single precious moment. I heard it veer right off the wooden path, tearing into the brush where the pack had landed, followed by a ripping sound. Yeah, it was tearing my nylon pack to pieces. I used that tiny window to push my body past its absolute limits, rounded the final bend of the trail where the gravel of the access road finally came into view. And there was my trusted Subi, sitting all by itself in the gravel lot, the most beautiful sight in the world I could see under that gray, stormy sky. I fumbled in my pocket for my keys, and my fingers completely slipped with sweat and rainwater, and just as I reached the edge of the tree line, a massive, pale shape launched itself out of the brush to my left and landed on the gravel just 20 feet behind me with this sick thud. The clicking sound in its throat was echoing in my head and echoing throughout the forest. I unlocked the driver's side door, threw myself inside, and slammed the door shut just as this heavy weight slammed into the rear passenger window. The glass webbed with fractures, but thankfully held together. I cranked the ignition, the engine roared to life, and I threw my Subi into reverse. In the bright beams of my backup lights, I finally got a clear look at this thing in its entirety. It was sprawling across the gravel, impossibly long, these pale fingers just gripping onto the dirt, and its featureless head pressed flat against the glass of my window, leaving the smear of dark, oily slime. I didn't wait around to see anything else. I slammed the shifter into drive and I just fled toward the safety of Route 206. I never went back for my backpack, and I never reported what happened to the park rangers because I knew exactly how a solo female hiker sounding hysterical about a monster in the woods would be received. In other words, it wouldn't be received. I'd be the crazy bitch who saw something that doesn't exist out on the trail. I do still hike, and I still love being outdoors. But I haven't been back to the Pine Barrens since then. There's plenty of other places to hike. But the funny thing is, the one thing I can't stand anymore is the silence of the woods on a hike before a storm. Believe me or don't, but that happened. I hope you'll read this. Thanks, everybody. The Thing in the Pond, submitted by Daryl and my other brother Daryl. My family has owned a few hundred acres of deep timber and rolling pasture out in rural Oklahoma for 3 generations. My brother Todd and I practically grew up out there. The heart of the property is a deep, spring-fed pond that sits tucked away in a low-lying hollow, completely cut off from the country road that goes by it. For as long as I can remember, that pond has been the center of some incredibly strange occurrences that we could never quite rationalize. It started back when we were teenagers camping out by the water. when we would wake up to find our coolers dragged into the shallows, their heavy plastic latches completely snapped off, and our food supplies wiped out. At first, we blamed stray dogs or raccoons, but the thefts always involved things no animal would care about, like shiny brass shell casings, cheap pocket knives left on folding tables, and even once a heavy iron skillet that just vanished from our fire pit. Over the decades, the thefts of this stuff turned into an accepted, kind of scary, eerie rule of camping on the family land. If you stayed near the pond after sundown, whatever lived in that black water was going to come ashore and take a toll. We tried setting up trail cameras on the surrounding oak trees, but we would only find them ripped off their mounts, and their lenses smeared with a thick, foul-smelling pond muck that ruined the electronics before they could capture a clear image. The only consistent evidence the thing ever left behind was its tracks in the red Oklahoma mud. Every single morning after a theft, there would be a single set of deep, heavy footprints leading straight out of the reeds, circle the campsite, and then head right back into the deep water. They weren't the tracks of a bear or a cougar. They belonged to something that walked entirely on 2 feet, with long, distinct toes that sank deep into the earth, as if whatever it was really heavy. The situation turned from a spooky family mystery into absolute terror during deer season in November of 2024. Todd and I had set up a primitive camp about 50 yards from the water's edge, confident that our years of experience and our hunting rifles would keep us safe from whatever was playing games with us. Around 2 o'clock one morning, the steady hum of crickets completely died out, and it was replaced by a heavy, rhythmic sound of splashing water. I sat up in my sleeping bag and grabbed my rifle as a massive, dark shape slowly rose out of the center of the pond and cut through the moonlight. It was easily 7 feet tall and dripped with long strings of waterweed, and its torso was impossibly wide and blocky. It didn't lurch or crawl. It walked with a deliberate, heavy stride straight towards our camp, making a low, wet, whistling sound. Todd scrambled out of his tent with his flashlight, but the moment the beam hit the creature, it let out a deep, vibrating growl, and then lunged forward with incredible speed. We didn't even think about shooting it. We just threw ourselves into the bed of my truck and watched through the cab glass as the giant, soaking wet silhouette casually ripped our heavy canvas wall tent down to the ground. Then it grabbed our entire supply cache and walked back towards the pond without ever breaking its gaze. We still hunt the property during the day, but now nobody stays past sunset anymore, because we finally realize that we are just guests on that land. Whatever the hell lives in that pond has no intention of being found. I've given up, and so has my family.
Scaredy Cat, submitted by Big Tom. After I got out of the military, I got very into bodybuilding, so much so that I decided to get into competitions. It was a huge part of my life, and I was a really big guy. I was working hard and doing it clean, too. This was during a time when steroid use was running rampant. I also had a part-time job as a bouncer at a bar, so I'm kind of a no-nonsense guy. I'm very fair, but I was also not going to put up with any shenanigans at a bar. I threw a lot of people out, I've been in a lot of fights, and that's not a very glamorous side of nightlife, but it was my job, and I did it. I was known as Tom the Killer. I had never killed anybody, and I was not the best of fighters. I was just a big guy. At any rate, this story happened 10 years into my marriage with my beautiful wife. We were living in a townhouse community, and unfortunately one day, one of our cats went missing. My kids came home crying, saying that they'd found Fluffy, and that Fluffy had been squashed on the road. My heart sank, and I went out to look. And sure enough, there was a furry blobbing mess on the road. I told my kids to go home, went and got a shovel and a cardboard box, scooped Fluffy into the box, and then took her back to a piece of land that was at the edge of our townhouse community. I buried Fluffy there and went home. Now, 2 days later, my wife and I were getting ready to go out with some friends who were coming over to pick us up. I heard a bang at the front door and figured, oh, that must be them. When I opened the door, I was staring into the face of Fluffy, clinging to our screen door as he always did when he wanted to come in. There I was, 6'2", 260 pounds of raw muscle. I screamed like a girl, turned around, and ran straight into a wall. My wife came out asking me what was wrong, and all I could yell was, "Fluffy, Fluffy!" Well, turns out it was Fluffy. The cat that my kids had found was not Fluffy. Fluffy did not come back from the dead, but for a moment I was convinced I was staring at a cat that I had just buried 2 days earlier. This for sure was our Fluffy. So yeah, I went from a big tough guy to a little scaredy cat in the matter of 0.5 seconds. I hope your listeners get a kick out of that. Us tough guys have a heart too. Uncle Josh note. Thanks for the story. That's awesome. Sad, but awesome. We actually have 2 new family members in our family. We went to get one cat for my daughter and came home with his brother as well. So now we've got our paranormal pup, who's right by my side right now, and 2 cute little kittens who are adorable. And I will also note that I changed the title of this story. Normally I don't do that, but I thought Scaredy Cat was a little bit better than I'm a Big Pussy. Thanks again for sending this in.
Hey gang, once again coming to you from my vehicle, but I was thinking about this after posting the last episode, and someone from a town that I kind of lived near, saying hello and hailing from the town of Lockport, reminded me, I lived in I guess you'd call it a hamlet or something. It's not really a town. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It's one of those kinds of places. A little rural outside of Lockport. It's a place called Cambria. And my bride and I lived there for a year before we moved to Northern Virginia for a little bit. But anyway, we were friends with the people who were renting it before we rented it. The landlord was a real nice guy. He lived next door. He originally lived in the house, put an addition on it, and then built his family home right next to it. Super nice guy. At any rate, so we knew this woman, her son and daughter that lived in this place. We were looking to get out of the apartment that I had when I first married my bride, so we were also pretty young at this time. At any rate, a very old house built in the 1880s, and I believe some nuns lived in it originally. There was a church not too far from there, but we moved in, and it was a nice place. It had its downsides because it was so old. It was extremely cold in the winter, but none of this has anything to do with what I really wanted to get down to. And forgive me if I've told you guys about this. I don't recall ever talking about this house. So right off the bat, I noticed some strange things at this place. There were voices that I would hear, but not super clear, but they were kids' voices. And I always heard them in this front room. Now, there wasn't much in that front room. I had my guitars and my amps and stuff like that in there. So, I would go in there and play, but I didn't really hang out in that front room all that much. The living room was right next to that. The front door to our front porch was right at the front of that living room, and then that front room was right off of that. So I'll come to that in a few minutes. At any rate, so I'm hearing these kids' voices, and I'm like, what the heck is that? And I'm thinking, well, maybe it's just sounds from outside. Now, my landlord, his kids were fully grown and out of the house. The folks who lived across the street from us were an elderly couple, and they didn't have kids. And the next closest neighbors were about maybe a quarter of a mile away, a little less. I mean, this was a really rural area. So I mentioned it to my bride, and she was like, well, I don't hear anything. No big deal. She would eventually hear other noises in the house that would freak her out from time to time. But come to find out, one day, after a couple of other things happened, she heard the kids. And I said, yeah, I told you I wasn't making this up. And we couldn't explain it. And then we started to find these vintage Barbie doll accessories, like a shoe or a purse. You know, they certainly were not new. And the young woman who lived there with her mom before us was in her 20s and didn't have anything like that. So at any rate, one day, the woman who lived there prior was getting remarried and was having some kind of shower or party at my mother-in-law's house. So my bride went over there and obviously hung out with them and this woman's daughter. And out of nowhere, the woman's daughter asks my bride, hey, so what do you think about the kids who live in the front room? And my wife, I wasn't there. She's like, oh my God, I went ice cold. She immediately got on her phone and called me and was like, oh my God, you weren't making that up. And we were not, this is real. This actually is there. They heard it too. And I started laughing and I said, yeah, there's something weird at this place. Now, not long after that, we had decided to move, and we were obviously packing everything up. And when we honeymooned on Nantucket. And part of our honeymoon, we had collected a bunch of really nice seashells and things like that, and had them in a basket. We had that on our dining room table, and one morning we woke up and they were not on the dining room table, they were in our living room, and a bunch of them were smashed. And my bride immediately thought it was our dog. We had our golden retriever at the time, not the new one. And she got really angry with him and was kind of giving him the business. And I was like, he didn't do this. This was not his work. And she starts to calm down for a second. And then she finally says, you know what? I'm sick of these damn kids in this house. And as soon as she said that, the front door to our porch slammed shut. And she just jumped up and said, that's it, I'm going to my parents. I don't care. You can stay here. I'm out of here. And she did. She went to visit her parents. And I was there, cleaning up the shells and stuff. But yeah, so some weird things. There were other things that happened there that I'll save for another time. But I thought I would share that. I haven't shared an Uncle Josh story for a while, but I wonder about those kids and if they're still there. And it brings up the conversations that I had on the Edge of the Unknown, my old paranormal radio show, of why things, beings, consciousnesses, whatever they might be, stay where they are. And occasionally I'll drive in the vicinity of that place to visit my in-laws, but never talked to the landlord about it. He never mentioned anything, and just wonder if those kids are still there. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that quick little story. Kind of creepy, kind of funny, and all part of what makes Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories go. Hope everybody's doing well out there.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description, and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.